So I recently picked up this book, Gap in the Gain by Ben Hardy and Dan Sullivan. And I'm only halfway through it, but my mind has been blown several times already. And if there was a book for ADHDers that had to be required reading, that's not even an ADHD book, it would be this one. Because the premise is so relevant to those of us who have struggled with perfectionism and fear of getting started and fear of judgment and rejection sensitive dysphoria and all of those complicated feelings and thoughts that we have as ADHDers that hold us back from starting things, following through with them, and actually acknowledging the fruits of our labor, which then develops into healthy self-confidence. So in today's video, I'm going to briefly break down the premise of the book, and then I'll break down how I think those of us with ADHD can use this idea as a framework for our lives so we can get out of perfectionistic thinking and just start taking messy action. So here's the premise of the book. The idea is that humans in general have a tendency to focus on what we haven't accomplished versus what we have accomplished. So if you can imagine somebody at a start line and they have an ideal of where they want to go. Let's say you are coming out of college and you want to start a business and you want to be rich and famous. So the ideal is Richard Branson. So you start on this entrepreneurial journey and you try and you fail and you try and you fail. And all you keep focusing on is the fact that you are not yet Richard Branson and the fact that you are getting nowhere. And the problem with this excessive focus on the gap and how we're not where we need to be is that number one, it undermines our confidence. Number two, it holds us back from truly understanding how much progress we've made. But number three, it can have some real deleterious psychological effects. And one thing that I'll point to that they talk about in this book is that they've looked at the rates of teen suicide and like what are the profiles of these kids that commit suicide, and a large portion of them, not all of them, were very high achievers. But the problem is that they were so focused on the gap between where they were and where they thought they should be that they felt like they would never win the game because they already felt like they were working so hard, yet they could never measure up by their own standards. So they decided to completely opt out of the game. So that is an example of not only how bad this can get, but how heavy this weight of feeling like we're not measuring up can impact us emotionally and in other areas of our lives. So the premise and message of this book is to not look at where you are versus the ideal, because the ideal is nothing more than a directional North Star, right? We're never going to reach an ideal because an ideal is like the horizon. The closer you get to it, the further it goes away. As we grow and we get closer to the ideal we had when we left high school, we continue to improve our ideal. You know, once we made our first 10,000, then we want to make 100,000, and then we want to make 1,000,000 and 10 million, right? The goalpost when it comes to our idealized self is always moving, and that is just a fact of life. But if we over-index on how we're not meeting that ideal, you can see now how it can cause a lot of havoc in our life. So their suggestion instead is to measure backwards and to focus entirely on the gain. So what does that look like? If you're starting out from high school and you start your first company and it fails, and the second company and it fails, and the third company and it does kind of well but putters along and then fails, and then you get into the fourth and the fifth company and they're starting to make a little bit money, but you haven't hit, your first six-figure launch or anything like that. But you just keep moving forward rather than focusing on the fact that you're not yet Richard Branson, and quite frankly, you never will be because there can only ever be one Richard Branson. Instead, you measure backwards at how far you've come, the skills that you've learned, the chops that you've developed, the failures that have given you probably the biggest insights that you'd never previously had. And speaking as someone who has had 5 previous failed businesses, I can tell you that this one wouldn't have been a success had I not had those failures. In the moment, it really sucked, but now I can see the benefit of them. So if you are someone who is mired in perfectionism and you're afraid to look foolish or make a mistake, then I want you to turn around and think about the version of yourself that you were 2 years ago, the version of yourself that didn't have the skills that you have now, or the resources that you have now, or the maturity or the ability to take hard knocks and keep going. If you weren't able to do it 2 years ago, it's probably because you weren't ready yet. You had to have a number of failures and learning lessons in order to be the person you are today. So the question is never why have I not reached my ideal self yet? The question is always, what is the next step I have to take that's going to give me the chops to take the step after that? This recently came into a conversation that I had with a previous client who was afraid to move forward on a business that he was planning to launch because of small minutia. And I knew the small minutia wasn't it. So he was emailing me and asking me questions about what platform are you using for this, or what measure can I expect for that? And I knew that wasn't really what was holding him back. What was holding him back was the fear of making a mistake, or the fear of looking foolish, or the fear that he might get halfway down the line of this new business and realize that he doesn't actually want to do it and that it was a waste of time and for nothing. And I have to tell you, no matter what you do in this life, it's never a waste of time, whether you finish it or not. You always pull forward skills, experiences, new awarenesses about yourself, new knowledge about yourself, so that the next decision you make is a more informed decision. And all of that can only happen when you are focused on the gain and not the gap. So here's a practical tool they share in the book that I thought was just so helpful, and I wanted to share that with you as well. One of the things that Ben Hardy talks about is this measure of success that we have, right? Like, we've got the idealized self that is basically perfection and doesn't exist. It's just the horizon. The closer you get to it, the further away it gets. And the interesting thing is that that ideal is based on the success that we see externally, right? Like, we look at people around us that we want to be like, and we think about how much money they have, or how much money they show that they have, whether they have a family, fancy job, fancy clothes. We take all of these different metrics of success, whether they're relevant to us or not, or whether they're value aligned to us or not, and we build this idealized version of ourselves. But what we don't do is build a measure of success based on how we are being. Because at the end of the day, success is not an external measuring stick. So number one, success is truly individual. What I think success is may not be what you think it is, and what you think it is may not be what I think it is. But we look at success as being this sort of universal metric. And number two, success is not a static metric. Maybe when you were a kid, you thought success was having $100 in the bank. And I'm sure as an adult, you've at some point had $100 in the bank, but do you feel successful? No, because again, your marker has changed. You've grown. So success is never about hitting one number and then you're automatically just blanket successful. Instead, success is a state of being. It's a set of habits, behaviors, and choices that we do, which determines whether or not we are being successful or not. So in that case, it makes perfect sense to create a list of behaviors and choices that we do when we're being successful, and vice versa. We can create a list of things that we do when we're not being successful. But let's start off with the success list. I took this exercise from that book, The Gap and the Gain, and this is the success list that I came up with. I am being successful when I'm doing what I want, where I want, and when I want. I have few or no obligations on my calendar. I have enough financial resources that I can support myself without working for the rest of my life if I choose. I am doing things out of authentic desire rather than a feeling of obligation. I'm 100% being myself. I am only surrounding myself with people I love and or admire, no whiny people. I'm being kind to myself, prioritizing self-care and well-being, especially movement and being well slept, and or when I am learning something or growing in a new way. I also made a counter list of when I'm not being successful, and basically that's when I'm laying on the couch drinking wine, scrolling social media, because that gets me absolutely nowhere. And there's a few other things on it as well. But I love that success list because now when I'm thinking about things that I want to do in the future or commitments I want to make or not make, I can put it against this list. Am I making this choice because I'm trying to people please, or am I doing it because I 100% want to do it? Is buying a certain thing going to bring me closer to my financial vision of success, or is it going to take me away? All of the decisions I make in a day or how I plan my week and where I want to go in my business and my life and my relationships can all be measured against this success list. And I'm either being successful or I'm not being successful, but there's absolutely no external benchmark numbers that are going to be meaningless the minute I meet them anyways. I now know exactly what my vision of success is. And while I may not know what I'm going to do with it next week or next month, at least I have a framework to make decisions with. So I actually put this into the template of my weekly planner so that I won't forget about it. I'm sure I won't use it for every single decision that I come up with, but when I get stuck on something, this is a great reference to come back to. And I highly recommend anyone doing the same. It is well worth your time. So on that note, just to recap, as I've gone through this, do you recognize yourself as focused on being in the gap gap or in the gain? Are you measuring yourself against all the things you haven't done, or are you turning around and measuring yourself based on everything you already have done, which is concrete and material? And if you're looking into the future at your ideal self that just keeps moving forward, maybe it's time to turn around and appreciate yourself for all the things you've already done. Not only is this going to make you psychologically more healthy, it's going to make you happier, it's going to make you more grateful, it's going to make you really stay present in the things that are important to you. And if you have this success list, it's going to help you make bigger decisions going forward. So I hope that was in some way mind-blowing to you. It certainly was to me. That's why I wanted to make this video. And on that note, thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.